Oh hello, Dragonfly Swarm. Lisa is a starter character, so I have her, you have her, your parents have her, your friends have her, everyone has a copy of Lisa. And she's never really dug herself into the meta of Genshin Impact, but excitingly enough, with the introduction of Dendro, she has seen a notable power spike, both in terms of her literal raw power and in terms of her versatility and flexibility. To the extent where I would argue that she's actually quite a fair character to consider building, especially given she's been introduced to some new gear along with the release of Sumeru that specifically tailors towards her newest and her strongest playstyles. So, in today's video, I'm gonna discuss everything you need to know in order to make your Lisa a strong and valuable character on your account, discussing the very intricate details of her kit, her constellations, her best weapons, artifacts, and all the exciting new things she's able to do with the new dendro teams. And if you enjoy this video or it helps you in any way, please consider leaving a like and subscribing because it really helps myself and my channel. Alright, let's get right into this shocking new side of Lisa by discussing her kit, or more specifically, her attack talent. Lisa's attack talent actually has some interesting attributes aside from the fact that she has innate electro infusion, because she also boasts one of the fastest attack animations of any typical Catalyst user, outside of Punchy Dude, of course. And although the scaling on her normal attacks are quite low, her charged attack actually has some of the highest scaling of any Catalyst user in the game. There are quite a few playstyles also that Lisa can fit into, some of which do incorporate her normal attacks, but only really to act as a driver for other abilities such as Fischl's Oz or as a trigger for Hyperbloom damage. So you don't typically need to worry about or invest in this talent, but it's there and it can be incorporated as a potent playstyle when she's driving powerful off-field units. It's also worth noting that Lisa's charged attacks can apply conductive stacks onto enemies, which are used to power up the scaling on her elemental skill. And so, Lisa's elemental skill is an interesting ability with a press version and a hold version. When you press it, the ability will launch a homing electro orb that slowly zooms towards enemies, and upon contact, it will deal a small amount of electro damage, and with her first ascension passive, it will apply one conductive stack to the enemy hit. Interestingly enough though, the orb actually explodes in a tiny AoE when it hits enemies, so when enemies are grouped together close enough, the orb will bounce per se, and apply multiple conductive stacks to the enemies you hit, assuming you hit multiple with the same orb. And I'm assuming future Marcus is putting a clip on the screen to demonstrate said mechanic, hopefully. Thus, with some mechanical setup and practice, you can actually very quickly stack the maximum of 3 conductive stacks onto enemies for very high skill damage, because by using the hold version of this skill, Lisa takes a few seconds to charge up, and after a short time, she'll strike every enemy around her for very high electro damage, which gets higher on enemies with more conductive stacks on them. Basically, it's like a built-in miniature nuke that Lisa can use, but it's quite clunky since the hold version takes a while to charge up, and the only way for Lisa to generate particles for herself, which is very important for her burst up time, is to hit enemies with the hold version of her skill, so she can't really not use it. It's also important to note that in that regard, hitting enemies with the tap version of Lisa's skill will never generate particles, which sucks, but whatever, we live and we learn. Lisa's elemental burst is the most important part of her kit for the vast majority of her playstyles because of its very high damage over time and its rare and unique ability to shred enemy defense by 15% anytime it hits enemies thanks to her 4th Ascension passive. The ability itself summons a giant lamp that rapidly strikes enemies with lightning arcs within its vicinity, and it will strike 29 times during its 15-second duration, meaning it can proc reactions like Aggravate upwards of 9 times. It's worth noting that while the arcs will target enemies at random, which means you're proccing reactions at random, the arcs do have a small AoE, so if enemies are grouped close enough, they will all be struck by each arc. And the reason this ability is amazing is because of its high off-field damage and good electro application, but it's restricted by a heavy 80 energy cost, which pretty much requires Lisa to run with some form of an energy battery even at C1. Because of this, her team building becomes a bit more restricted, but not unbearably so, and in general, these abilities work together to create a character who is very strong as a sub-DPS and an enabler, but yet Lisa is also quite versatile in that she can act as a driver for some powerful teams, or even a dedicated support for certain main carries, and find immense value in doing so. It helps too that she actually ascends with Elemental Mastery, which before Dendro seemed quite useless, all things considered, but now it's quite an enjoyable bonus stat for Lisa to have. Oh, and for talent priority, generally you're gonna want to level up her burst, then her skill, then her attack talent last, but this order can change around depending on which playstyle you'll be using the most with her, and in lots of cases it's equally valuable to just level up her burst and her skill at the same time. And I guess many players assume she's weak for different reasons or that she can only be played a certain way, which has never really been true, but especially now with 3.0 is quite untrue, and I'm here to prove it. So let's move on to discussing her quite valuable constellations, which depending on your dedication to Lisa can actually be very relevant to talk about since you can buy her constellations using Star Glitter. At C1, Lisa gets to enjoy a bit of relief on her heavy energy restraints, although it entirely depends on how many enemies you hit with her Hold E skill. So in actuality, it could be quite a useful constellation, cutting a respectable 10 energy off of her burst, or it could be almost irrelevant, cutting only 2 energy off. Generally, you'll meet somewhere in the middle though, so it's a decent constellation, but not the strongest selling point for her constellations overall. At C2, Lisa enjoys some great quality of life upgrades for her Hold skill, as she'll now be much harder to disrupt while charging it up, which is very nice. It'll basically mean that she can much more comfortably run without shielders, making her even more aggressive to build around, which is snazzy and fun, and that's kind of all there is to say about that. C3 is relatively nice because her burst damage scales pretty well per level, so the extra 3 levels will help her to deal a noticeable amount of extra damage with each burst, but extra damage is all this constellation really provides. C4, however, is written kinda poorly. It looks like a relatively pointless constellation, but what it actually does is it allows the lightning arcs from Lisa's burst to strike multiple enemies at once rather than just one enemy at a time. In AoE scenarios, this will quite obviously massively increase her burst's already very high damage potential, and as far as her constellations go, it's one of her most dramatic power spikes by far. Now, each lightning arc is technically randomized in how many it will shoot out, between 1 to 3, so it's actually a bit difficult to quantify exactly how powerful this will be in any given scenario, but in general, in AoE situations, it's going to be a massive increase to Lisa's team damage contribution. C5 is going to add 3 levels to Lisa's skill, which all things considered isn't that great, and definitely not as impactful as her C3's burst upgrades, but it's still extra damage, so that is nice. And finally, at C6, Lisa enjoys a pretty significant quality of life upgrade in which she can apply a full 3 conductive stacks to nearby enemies whenever she takes to the field, solidifying and wildly improving the smoothness of her sub-DPS playstyle. This essentially allows her to completely ignore the mechanical skill required to play her before C6, which is quite nice, and it makes her more flexible in combat, but in general, you can still play her to her highest potential even without this constellation. So as good as it is, it's not necessary. In general though, Lisa's constellations are mostly aimed at improving her fluidity in combat, with a few large damage spikes here and there, so if you're dedicated to playing her, it might be worth considering saving up for her constellations in the Star Glitter shop, but rest assured that you don't need any of these constellations to enjoy large value from her kit. And it just so happens that all the footage in this video comes from my C1 humble Lisa, so mine's not crazy kitted out either, and yet she's pulling in some damage. Anyway, let's move on. Artifacts.
Oh, there's so many to talk about.
So, with the introduction of Dendro, almost every Electro character has gained access to a bunch of sets that weren't usually that great on them, and Lisa is no different. She's gained access to quite a few that have notably enhanced her value, and we're going to talk about them as efficiently as we can, starting with 4-piece Gilded Dreams. This artifact set is generally tailored towards Electro characters for the value of stacking large amounts of EM so that they can spam Aggravate and Hyper Bloom reactions for high damage per second. It's not exclusively for Electro characters, obviously, but it tends to fit best on these kinds of characters. As such, the set works quite well on Lisa if you're stacking at least 180 Elemental Mastery from the 4-piece passive, but it's only really worthwhile when she's playing as the driver for Hyper Bloom teams or as a source of Aggravate damage in Aggravate teams, because of how dramatically these reactions scale with character level and Elemental Mastery. Not to mention, the 4-piece passive itself is a conditional passive, so it won't actually have a 100% uptime, but on characters like Lisa who are constantly triggering reactions anyways, the downtime isn't really a detriment to her damage as long as you're rotating properly. Still though, I would argue there are better sets, one of which I'd like to point out being 4-piece Thunder Soother. I have favorites. This artifact set was already quite strong for Electro charge teams back before Dendro, but only because Electro auras could temporarily coexist with Hydro on enemies, so the uptime on the 4-piece damage bonus was quite high. Now though, inside of Aggravate teams, Thunder Soother is even stronger because Electro auras will completely coexist with Dendro auras on quickened enemies, which is a complicated way of saying in Aggravate teams, Lisa will almost constantly be benefiting from the 35% damage bonus. And this is so important because Aggravate damage scales with external damage bonuses like these, so she'll be outputting quite a bit more damage and it will feel almost unconditional considering how easy it is to maintain Electro auras on enemies in Aggravate teams. One of the only downsides is that it is a 4-piece set and it will require you to get pretty lucky with substats in order to make it strictly better than other options you may have at your disposal, especially if you're not running Lisa with good battery teammates who can help to cover her heavy energy cost. And that same sentiment can be made about the next set I want to mention, 4-piece Thundering Fury. Now, Thundering Fury's 4-piece effect used to be relatively undesirable, but now that it provides a bonus to the calculation of Aggravate damage, it's shot up in strength just enough to become notably competitive with Lisa's other 4-piece options. And while it is, once again, a 4-piece set, so it'll be more difficult to roll a desirable stat spread, it is worth mentioning for its strength. Also the bonus to Hyper Bloom damage. By the way, I do believe the cooldown of her Hold E is affected by the 4-piece passive, but this isn't really desirable in most most of Lisa's teams anyways, because she already has a hard time fitting in one hold E because of how much field time it causes her to take, so 2 would be even more difficult to capitalize on. In regards to her more supportive focused sets, the first one I want to mention is 4-piece Noblesse Oblige, simply because it's a reliable and staple set for burst support units, which is a role that Lisa can fill quite well as long as she's maintaining high burst uptime. So the extra burst damage for herself and the team-wide attack buff is, as you'd expect, quite enjoyable in most teams you can slot her in. But also, 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate can be pretty good as a burst support as well, but not for why you probably think. I would only recommend this for burst support Lisa because in order to squeeze the most value out of this set, Lisa has to kind of overcap her energy needs, meaning you're sacrificing other aspects of her offensive power in favor of higher burst uptime, which in most cases is simply for the high electro application and her 4th Ascension defense shred, both of which things are applied by her burst. And finally, from the more supportive focus sets, we have 4-piece Instructors, which is a 4-star artifact set that essentially provides a massive team-wide EM buff, and Elemental Mastery is extremely enjoyable in dendro teams, most of which teams happen to be some of Lisa's strongest. So her ability to grant the team 120 Elemental Mastery is quite valuable even for herself because of her high aggravate and or hyperbloom output. The only issue is that because it's a 4-star set, you'll have to sacrifice a hefty chunk of Lisa's own stats for the set bonuses, but this won't be the end of the world as long as you're not relying strictly on her personal damage when using this set. And obviously, to round out the artifact combinations, any 2-piece combination of an attack set, an Elemental Mastery set, Emblem of Severed Fate, or Thundering Fury can all work on Lisa to varying degrees in all of her teams. 2-piece combos are far easier to pull desirable substats on, so generally for sub DPS or main DPS Lisa, 2-piece Thundering Fury 2-piece attack will be your best bet, but in teams where her damage will mostly come from reactions, 2-piece Thundering Fury 2-piece EM might prove stronger. It all depends on how you're playing your Lisa. With Lisa's artifact main stats, for most of her typical playstyles, you're gonna want a crit circlet and electro damage goblet, and then the sands can either be attack percent, elemental mastery, or energy recharge. Typically attack percent will be your best bet considering a few factors, but in teams where Lisa's reaction damage contributes heavily to the team, say in aggravate teams or hyperbloom teams, an EM sands can be competitive, albeit generally more situational. And I'd only recommend running an energy recharge sands if you're using 4-piece emblem or if you're seriously struggling to keep her burst up in teams where she really needs it. But keep in mind, you'll almost always be losing a considerable chunk of damage by running energy recharge sands. There are some guides here and there that mention a triple elemental mastery main stat Lisa build for teams in which she's a main carry for reaction damage, such as overload teams, and while this can translate to her aggravate teams, generally it won't be as strong as just using the typical crit circlet, electro goblet, etc., because unlike overload, aggravate is a reaction that actually does benefit from Lisa's crit damage and elemental damage bonuses, which heavily emphasizes the value of those stats for her. With substats, again, it depends on the team, but typically you'll want to first prioritize her energy recharge so that you can meet her requirement, which unfortunately could literally be as little as 120% or as high as 200% energy recharge. It depends entirely on her teams. If you have good energy circulation such as electro resonance and or a teammate that can use, for example, Favonius weapons, you might end up only needing around 120% to 150% ER, but in teams where Lisa is the only electro unit, and especially if she isn't the driver, she's gonna need upwards of 170 to 200% energy recharge. Then after those stats, you can focus on crit substats to balance out a nice 1:2 ratio. Then Lisa enjoys attack percent and EM substats equally, favoring attack in teams with fewer reactions and favoring EM in teams with heavy emphasis on reactions. Moving onwards and upwards to Lisa's best weapons, she has quite a few actually, and a good amount of them are completely free to play, so naturally I'm gonna go down the list kind of, sort of in order, from her strongest weapons to her weakest but still viable weapons. Starting with Kagura's Verity, which is currently her undisputed best in slot. The weapon provides all the stats Lisa could want, granting a high base attack and a very nice crit damage bonus, plus the passive is extremely easy for her to maximize, so she'll very much enjoy the elemental damage bonuses and the extra skill damage, plus inside of aggravate teams, the high crit damage and the elemental damage bonus is especially enjoyable. The only downside to this weapon is that it will basically force you to spam the tap version of Lisa's skill at least twice, so even if you utilize her bounce mechanics to quickly stack conductive stacks on enemies, or you use her C6, you'll have to continue to spam her tap skill before using the hold skills so that you can capitalize on the weapon's passive, because if you don't, it generally falls behind Lisa's next best weapon, the Skyward Atlas. Skyward Atlas is a very good weapon on Lisa for its extremely high base attack and bonus attack stat it provides, as well as the unconditional elemental damage bonus it provides on its passive. And as I said, in most scenarios, it's very competitive with Kagura's Verity, generally pulling ahead in teams with lower emphasis on reactions or in situations where you don't fully proc Kagura's weapon passive. So it's an easy catalyst to use and one of her strongest on top of that. Next on the list though is Lost Prayer, which generally falls behind Skyward and Kagura's because the passive isn't going to stack for the majority of Lisa's playstyles, but it's still one of her strongest weapons, even disregarding the ramp up part of the passive, mostly because of the high base attack, the added movement speed, and the very enjoyable crit rate bonus. You can also get away with Memory of Dust, but you won't find worthwhile value from it unless you have Lisa consistently shielded and on the field, which means I'd only typically recommend this weapon in teams where Lisa is a driver for reaction heavy teams, because she has much less situational options at her disposal, and with external attack buffs, this weapon falls significantly behind some of those other options, such as Solar Pearl and the Widsith, both of which provide nice crit value in base attacks, which in the past have made them almost identically competitive as Lisa's strongest 4-star weapons. But I would argue that with the introduction of dendro reactions and thus the heavy emphasis on elemental damage and elemental mastery bonuses, the Widsith has become a better option overall in those teams. Still though, both provide a lot to Lisa's playstyles. Blackcliff Agate is another option and a pretty easily accessible one, but it's kinda average for a 4-star option and will generally fall behind Lisa's other similarly accessible weapons such as Hakushin Ring and the newly introduced Fruit of Fulfillment. Hakushin Ring was originally considered to be Lisa's best free-to-play weapon with a respectable damage output for its energy recharge bonus, which allows Lisa to focus much less on energy stats, but also the passive was pretty busted for herself and her team, so it's like the perfect dual-edged weapon for her, and you know, it still is, but I'd argue the game's newest craftable weapon, Fruit of Fulfillment, is just as valuable. The weapon provides similar stats to Hakushin Ring, except its passive essentially grants a very large EM bonus at the cost of Lisa's attack, but funny enough, Lisa can snapshot her burst before the attack begins to cut from her weapon passive, but the EM bonus won't snapshot, so it'll continue to ramp up on her burst, allowing her to basically completely circumvent the downside to the weapon and make it very potent for reaction teams and dendro teams.
A few respectable mentions I want to include are Mappa Mare for its newfound importance in dendro-related teams, Sacrificial Fragments if you plan on running full EM Lisa and Hyper Bloom or Overload teams, and then if you have it, Oathsworn Eye for Lisa's personal damage and energy needs, although it isn't too crazy of a weapon on her.
The only other weapon worth mentioning is Wine and Song, and even then, it's only barely better than Lisa's free-to-play options, so it'll be the last weapon I recommend for the sake of saving time explaining weapons that aren't even as strong as Lisa's craftables, which are quite strong, I should add. Finally today, we're gonna talk about Lisa's best teams, and I'm gonna be mostly focusing on the new dendro teams since they play such a large role in her viability as of right now, but I'll also brush over some of her other teams as well since she can slot into a bunch of different teams with a bunch of different playstyles. Generally though, as confusing as her versatility is, Lisa's strongest playstyle is that of a sub DPS in which she relies on her burst to deal high electro damage over time and enable her teammates to deal more damage with her A4 passive and electro related reactions. Keeping all of that in mind, it makes Lisa quite a respectable character to slot into aggravate teams as an enabler for another electro carry such as Fischl, Beto, or Raiden. Most specifically with Fischl since it's the most budget friendly and still extremely strong because of Fischl's A4. Fischl is able to battery Lisa quite well, and in turn, Lisa shreds enemy defense for Fischl and procs her own high output of aggravate reactions all the while, making this duo quite strong when paired with Dendro Traveler or Kole, and then a flex spot which can be filled by any number of characters. Usually your best options for this flex spot are characters that can provide some form of survivability without disrupting aggravate reactions, so Diona, Jin, Zhongli, or I suppose Sayu. But you could also opt for more aggressive characters like Venti, Kazuha, or Sucrose, or a third electro unit if you're confident in your ability to not die, which I am not. I've noticed personally that Lisa feels the most fluid in aggravate teams when played with Fischl, Dendro Traveler, and Jin, but again, there are a ton of variations of aggravate teams that work for her, but I don't really recommend making Lisa the only electro character in these teams because she'll have a hard time with her energy and she won't provide enough aggravate damage on her own to warrant this team's viability. But next on the list is spread teams, which currently only works for Tignati because he's the only Dendro DPS in the game right now, but luckily Lisa is a very flexible option for spread teams because she can work together with another electro unit to help circulate energy and force quick rotations, or she can work as the only electro unit and act as a buffer strictly for Tignati as long as you cover her energy needs as required. Surprisingly, Lisa is one of the best aggressive electro enablers you can use for this role in spread teams since her 4th Ascension defense shred is so valuable and very rare to Dendro DPS units, so generally speaking, as long as her energy is covered and you're focused on her utility, this is a very solid new role for her to fill. Personally, I found the most value and enjoyment in building the spread team as Tignati, Lisa, Fischl, and Zhongli, but you can substitute Zhongli for Diona. And the team felt extremely comfortable to play, but yet the rotations are very flexible, which helps to alleviate Lisa's clunky rotation issues, and allows her to provide as much utility as possible to Tignati and Fischl for their spread and aggravate damage respectively. In my opinion, I feel like this is going to be one of Lisa's strongest teams once we get a hold of more dendro DPS units, but I could be wrong. That was just kind of speculation. Anyways, finally with dendro teams for now is Lisa's version of Hyper Bloom teams, which I'm not gonna lie, were actually really fun. I don't even typically like Bloom teams that much, but thanks to Lisa's fast catalyst attacks, she acts as a pretty respectable driver for Hydro and Electro characters like Fischl, Beidou, Xingqiu, Yelan, Kokomi, etc. So when you pair those characters with Dendro Traveler, you get Hyper Bloom teams in which Lisa acts as the driver and enabler for Hyper Bloom spam. This allows for very high single target damage, as for example my humble level 80 Lisa with a full elemental mastery build was causing each Hyper Bloom seed to deal upward of 25,000 damage to each target, which is absolutely insane if you can consistently proc the seeds. It's worth noting that in this team specifically, it's actually quite worth building into a full EM Lisa with, for example, a 4-piece Gilded Dreams set, because Hyper Bloom is transformative and thus benefits a lot from EM and character level and not at all from her crit damage and whatnot. Overall, I'd say it's going to take a heavier Dendro applicator than Dendro Traveler to make this Hyper Bloom team a full-on meta team, but it's already on the right track for its very high damage potential, and Lisa is a fun and respectable candidate for the team. As for other teams outside of Dendro stuff though, Lisa has always been surprisingly good as a driver for Taser teams with Fischl or Beidou, especially if you have Venti, considering how well Lisa's abilities interact with Venti's burst. But she's also very strong as a hyper carry support for characters like Raiden or Eula thanks to her valuable and rare defense shred, among other synergies. And though there are other teams worth mentioning for Lisa, most of them have already been brilliantly covered by other theory crafters and guide makers since Genshin's release, so I wanted to stick close to the new stuff and explain those as clearly as possible for players skeptical about or interested in building Lisa as of 3.0, because overall, she's not a bad character at all. She's definitely less convenient than other characters and thus will likely never be an actually popular pick, but with the introduction of Dendro, she's seen a large increase in her versatility, her usefulness, and her power, and she has definitely become more fun to play, so I suppose time will tell how much more value she can squeeze out of Dendro teams, most specifically spread teams, which I'm keeping a close eye on, but for now, it was definitely enough to warrant talking about. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video or it helped you in any way, please consider liking and subscribing, and also follow me on Twitch, because I think I'm live right now. I mean, the me that's speaking right now is like 20 hours in the past to when most of you are hearing this, but I think I'm live. You should go check and say hi to me. Alright, I'm out, friends.